during the first days of this long canoe voyage, only to be compared to those of Orellana and Condamine on the Amazon, the Americans were fortunate enough to meet with some Sioux Indians, an old Frenchman, a Canadian coureur des bois or trapper, who spoke the languages of most of the Missouri tribes, and consented to accompany the expedition as interpreter. They passed the mouths of the Osage, Kansas, Platte or Nebraska and White River, all tributaries of the Missouri successively, and met various parties of Osage and Sioux, or Maha Indians, who all appeared to be in a state of utter degradation. One tribe of Sioux had suffered so much from smallpox that the male survivors, in a fit of rage and misery, had killed the women and children spared by the terrible malady, and fled from the infected neighborhood. A little farther north dwelt the Recounts or Rex, at first supposed to be the cleanest, most polite, and most industrious of the tribes the expedition met with, but a few thefts soon modified that favorable judgment. It is curious that these people do not depend entirely on hunting, but cultivate corn, peas, and tobacco. This is not, however, the case with the Mandans, who are a more robust race. A custom obtains among them, also characteristic of Polynesia. They do not bury their dead but expose them on a scaffold. Clark's narrative gives us a few details relating to this strange tribe. The Mandans look upon the Supreme Being only as an embodiment of the power of healing. As a result, they worship two gods, whom they call the Great Medicine or the Physician, and the Great Spirit. It would seem that life is so precious to them that they are impelled to worship all that can prolong it. Their origin is strange. They originally lived in a large subterranean village hollowed out under the ground on the borders of a lake. A vine, however, struck its roots so deeply in the earth as to reach their habitations, and some of them ascended to the surface by the aid of this impromptu ladder. The descriptions given by them on their return of the vast hunting grounds, rich in game and fruit, which they had seen, led the rest of the tribe to resolve to reach so favored a land. Half of them had gained the surface, when the vine, bending beneath the weight of a fat woman, gave way and rendered the ascent of the rest impossible. After death, the Mandans expect to return to their subterranean home, but only those who die with a clear conscience can reach it. The guilty will be flung into a lake. The explorers took up their quarters for the winter amongst the Mandans on the 1st of November. They built huts, as comfortable as possible with the materials at their command, and in spite of the extreme cold, gave themselves up to the pleasures of hunting, which soon became a positive necessity of their existence. When the ice should break up on the Missouri, the explorers hoped to continue their voyage, but on their sending the boat down to St. Louis, laden with the skins and furs already obtained, only 30 men were found willing to carry the expedition through to the end. The travelers soon passed the mouth of the Yellowstone River, with a current nearly as strong as that of the Missouri, flowing through districts abounding in game. Cruel was their perplexity when they arrived at a fork where the Missouri divided into two rivers of nearly equal volume, for which was the main stream. Captain Lewis with a party of scouts ascended the southern branch, and soon came in sight of the Rocky Mountains, completely covered with snow. Guided to the spot by a terrific uproar, he beheld the Missouri fling itself in one broad sheet of water over a rocky precipice, beyond which it formed a broken series of rapids, extending for several miles. He beheld the Missouri. He beheld the Missouri. The detachment now followed this branch, which led them into the heart of the mountains, and for 3 or 4 miles dashed along between two perpendicular walls of rock, finally dividing itself into 3 parts, to which were given the names of Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin, after celebrated American statesmen. The last heights were soon crossed, and then the expedition descended the slopes overlooking the Pacific. The Americans had brought with them a Sashaun woman, who had been protected as a girl by the Indians of the East, and not only did she serve the explorers faithfully as an interpreter, but also, through her recognition of a brother in the chief of a tribe disposed to be hostile, she from that moment secured cordial treatment for the white men. Unfortunately, the country was poor, the people living entirely on wild berries, bark, and the little game they were able to obtain. The Americans, little accustomed to this frugal fare, had to eke it out by eating their horses, which had grown very thin, and buying all the dogs the natives would consent to sell. Hence they obtained the nickname of dog-eaters. As the temperature became milder, so did the character of the natives, whilst food grew more abundant, and as they came down the Oregon, also known as the Columbia, the salmon formed a seasonable addition to the bill of fare. When the Columbia, which is dangerous for navigation, approaches the sea, it forms a vast estuary, where the waves from the offing meet the current of the river. The Americans more than once incurred considerable risk of being swallowed up, with their frail canoe, before they reached the shores of the ocean. Glad to have accomplished the aim of their expedition, the explorers wintered at the mouth of the river, and when the fine weather set in they made their way back to St. Louis, arriving there in May, 1806, after an absence of 2 years, 4 months and 10 days. They had in that time, according to their own estimate, traversed less than 1378 leagues. The impulse was now given, and reconnoitring expeditions in the interior of the new continent rapidly succeeded each other, assuming, a little later, a scientific character which gives them a position of their own in the history of discovery. A few years later, one of the greatest colonizers of whom England can boast, Sir Stamford Raffles, organizer of the expedition which took possession of the Dutch colonies, was appointed military governor of Java. During an administration extending over 5 years, Raffles brought about numerous reforms and abolished slavery. Absorbing as was this work, however, it did not prevent him from publishing 2 huge quarto volumes, which are as interesting as they are curious. They contain, in addition to the history of Java, a vast number of details about the natives of the interior, until then little known, together with much circumstantial information respecting the geology and natural history of the country. It is no wonder, therefore, that in honor of the man who did so much to make Java known, the name of Rafflesia should have been given to an immense flower native to it, and of which some specimens measure over 3 feet in diameter and weigh some 10 pounds. Warrior of Java. Warrior of Java. Facsimile of early engraving. Raffles was also the first to penetrate to the interior of Sumatra, of which the coast only was previously known. He visited the districts occupied by the Pasaumas, sturdy tillers of the soil, the northern provinces, with Memenkabu, the celebrated Malayan capital, and crossed the southern half of the island, from Bencoolen to Palembang. Sir Stamford Raffles' fame, however, rests principally upon his having drawn the attention of the Indian government to the exceptionally favourable position of Singapore, which was converted by him into an open port, and grew rapidly into a prosperous settlement. Chapter 2. The Exploration and Colonization of Africa. 1. Peddy and Campbell in the Soudan, Ritchie and Lyon in Fezzan, Denham, Oudney and Clapperton in Fezzan, and in the Tibu country, Lake Tchad and its tributaries, Kuka and the chief villages of Bornu, Mandara, Arazia or Raid in the Felata country, defeat of the Arabs and death of Bukaloum, Logan, death of Toul, en route for Kano, death of Oudney, Kano, Sakatu, Sultan Bello, return to Europe. The power of Napoleon, and with it the supremacy of France, was scarcely overthrown. The titanic contests, to gratify the ambition of one man at the expense of the intellectual progress of humanity, were scarcely at an end, before an honourable rivalry awoke once more, and new scientific and commercial expeditions were set on foot. A new era had commenced. Foremost in the ranks of the governments, which organised and encouraged exploring expeditions, we find as usual that of England. It was in Central Africa, the vast riches of which had been hinted at in the accounts given of their travels by Horniman and Burckhardt, that the attention of the English was now concentrated. As early as 1816 Major Peddy, starting from Senegal, reached Kakandi on the river Nunez, succumbing, however, to the fatigue of the journey and unhealthiness of the climate soon after his arrival in that town. Major Campbell succeeded him in the command of the expedition, and crossed the lofty mountains of Futajalian, losing in a few days several men and part of the baggage animals. Arrived at the headquarters of the Olmami, as most of the kings of this part of Africa are called, the expedition was detained for a long time, and only obtained permission to depart on payment of a large sum. Most disastrous was the return journey, for the explorers had not only to recross the streams they had before forded with such difficulty, but they were subjected to so many insults, annoyances, and exactions, that to put an end to them, Campbell was obliged to burn his merchandise, break his guns, and sink his powder. Against so much fatigue and mortification, added to the complete failure of his expedition, Major Campbell failed to bear up, and he died with several of his officers in the very place where Major Peddy had closed his career. The few survivors of the party reached Sierra Leone after an arduous march. A little later, Ritchie and Captain George Francis Lyon, availing themselves of the prestige which the siege of Algiers had brought to the British flag, and of the cordial relations which the English consul at Tripoli, had succeeded in establishing with the principal Moorish authorities, determined to follow Horniman's route and penetrate to the very heart of Africa. On the 25th March 1819, the travellers left Tripoli with Mahamd el-Mawkni, Bey of Fezzan, who is called Sultan by his subjects. Protected by this escort, Ritchie and Lyon reached Merzuk without molestation, but there the former died on the 2nd November, worn out by the fatigue and privations of the journey across the desert. Lyon, who was ill for some time from the same causes, recovered soon enough to foil the designs of the Sultan, who, counting on his death, had already begun to take possession of his property, and also of Ritchie's. The captain could not penetrate beyond the southern boundaries of Fezzan, but he had time to collect a good deal of valuable information about the chief towns of that province and the language of its inhabitants. To him, we likewise owe the first authentic details of the religion, customs, language, and extraordinary costumes of the Tuareg Arabs, a wild tribe inhabiting the Great Sahara Desert. Captain Lyon's narrative also contains a good deal of interesting information collected by himself on Bornu, Wadi, and the Soudan, although he was unable to visit those places in person. The results obtained did not by any means satisfy the English government, which was most eager to open up the riches of the interior to its merchants. Consequently, the authorities received favourably the proposals made by Dr. Walter Audney, a Scotchman, whose enthusiasm had been aroused by the travels of Mungo Park. This Dr. Audney was a friend of Hugh Clapperton, a lieutenant in the Navy, 3 years his senior, who had distinguished himself in Canada and elsewhere, but had been thrown out of employment and reduced to half pay by the Peace of 1815. Hearing of Audney's scheme, Clapperton at once determined to join him in it, and Audney begged the minister to allow him the aid of that enterprising officer, whose special knowledge would be of great assistance. Lord Bathurst made no objection, and the two friends, after receiving minute instructions, embarked for Tripoli, where they ascertained that Major Denham was to take the command of their expedition. Denham was born in London on the 31st December, 1783, and began life as an articled pupil to a country lawyer. As an attorney's clerk, he found his duties so irksome and so little suited to his daring spirit that his longing for adventure soon led him to enlist in a regiment bound for Spain. He remained with the army, but after the peace he employed his leisure in visiting France and Italy. Denham, eager to obtain distinction, had chosen the career which would best enable him to achieve it, even at the risk of his life, and he now resolved to become an explorer. With him to think was to act. He had asked the minister to commission him to go to Timbuktu by the route Laing afterwards took when he heard of the expedition under Clapperton and Audney, and he now begged to be allowed to join them. Without any delay, Denham obtained the necessary equipment, and accompanied by a carpenter named William Hillman, he embarked for Malta, joining his future travelling companions at Tripoli on the 21st November, 1821. The English at this time enjoyed very great prestige, not only in the States of Barbary, on account of the bombardment of Algiers, but also because the British consul at Tripoli had, by his clever diplomacy, established friendly relations with the government to which he was accredited. This prestige extended beyond the narrow range of the northern states, the nationality of certain travellers, the protection accorded by England to the port. The British victories in India had all been vaguely rumoured even in the heart of Africa, and the name of Englishman was familiar without any particular meaning being attached to it. According to the English consul, the route from Tripoli to Bornu was as safe as that from London to Edinburgh. This was, therefore, the moment to seize opportunities which might not occur again. The three travellers, after a cordial reception from the Bey, who placed all his resources at their disposal, lost no time in leaving Tripoli, and with an escort provided by the Moorish governor, they reached Merzuk, the capital of Fezzan, on the 8th April, 1822, without difficulty, having indeed been received with great enthusiasm in some of the places through which they passed. At Sakna, Denham tells us, the governor came out to meet them, accompanied by the principal inhabitants and hundreds of the country people, who crowded round their horses, kissing their hands with every appearance of cordiality and delight, and shouting Inglesi, Inglesi, as the visitors entered the town. This welcome was the more gratifying from the fact that the travellers were the first Europeans to penetrate into Africa without wearing a disguise. Denham adds that he feels sure their reception would have been far less cordial had they stooped to play the part of impostors by attempting to pass for Mohammedans. At Merzuk they were harassed by annoyances similar to those which had paralysed Horniman. In their case, however, circumstances and character were alike different, and without allowing themselves to be blinded by the compliments paid them by the Sultan, the English, who were thoroughly in earnest, demanded the necessary escort for the journey to Bornu. It was impossible, they were told, to start before the following spring, on account of the difficulty of collecting a kafilah or caravan, and the troops necessary for its escort across the desert. A rich merchant, however, Bubakar Bukalum by name, a great friend of the Pacha, gave the explorers a hint that if he received certain presents, he would smooth away all difficulties. He even offered to escort them himself to Bornu, for which province he was bound if he could obtain the necessary permission from the Pacha of Tripoli. Denham, believing Bukalum to be acting honestly, went off to Tripoli to obtain the governor's sanction, but on his arrival there he obtained only evasive answers, and finally threatened to embark for England, where he said he would report the obstacles thrown in his way by the Pacha in the carrying out of the objects of the exploring expedition. These menaces produced no effect, and Denham actually set sail, and was about to land at Marseille when he received a satisfactory message from the Bey, begging him to return, and authorizing Bukalum to accompany him and his companions. On the 30th October Denham rejoined Oudney and Clapperton at Merzuk, finding them considerably weakened by fever and the effects of the climate. Denham, convinced that change of air would restore them to health, persuaded them to start and begin the journey by easy stages. He himself set out on the 20th of November with a caravan of merchants from Messerata, Tripoli, Sakna and Merzuk, escorted by 210 Arab warriors chosen from the most intelligent and docile of the tribes, and commanded by Bukalum. The expedition took the route followed by Lyon and soon reached Tejeri, which is the most southerly town of Fezzan, and the last before the traveller enters the desert of Bilma. Denham made a sketch of the castle of Tejeri from the southern bank of a salt lake near the town. Tejeri is entered by a low, narrow, vaulted passage leading to a gate in a second rampart. The wall is pierced with apertures, which render the entrance by the narrow passage very difficult. Above the second gate there is also an aperture through which darts and firebrands may be hurled upon the besiegers, a mode of warfare once largely indulged in by the Arabs. Inside the town there are wells of fairly good water. Denham is of opinion that Tejeri, restored, well garrisoned and provisioned, could sustain a long siege. Its situation is delightful. It is surrounded by date trees, and the water in the neighbourhood is excellent. A chain of low hills stretches away to the east. Snipes, ducks and wild geese frequent the salt lakes near the town. Leaving Tejeri, the travellers entered a sandy desert, across which it would not have been easy to find the way, had it not been marked out by the skeletons of men and animals strewn along it, especially about the wells. One of the skeletons we saw today, says Denham, still looked quite fresh. The beard was on the chin, the features could be recognized. "It is my slave," exclaimed one of the merchants of the kafilah. "I left him near here 4 months ago." "Make haste and take him to the market," cried a facetious slave merchant, lest someone else should claim him. A kafilah of slaves. A kafilah of slaves. Facsimile of early engraving. Here and there in the desert are oases containing towns of greater or less importance, at which the caravans halt. Kishi is one of the most frequented of these places, and there the money for the right of crossing the desert is paid. The Sultan of Kishi, the ruler of a good many of these petty principalities, and who takes the title of Commander of the Faithful, was remarkable for a complete disregard of cleanliness, a peculiarity in which, according to Denham, his court fully equalled him. This Sultan paid Bukalum a visit in his tent, accompanied by 6 Tibus, some of whom were positively hideous. Their teeth were of a dark yellow colour, the result of chewing tobacco, of which they are so fond that they use it as snuff as well as to chew. Their noses looked like little round bits of flesh, stuck onto their faces with nostrils so wide that they could push their fingers right up them. Denham's watch, compass and musical snuff-box astonished them not a little. He defines these people as brutes with human faces. A little further on the travellers reached the town of Kirby, situated in a wadi near a low range of hills of which the highest are not more than 400 feet above the sea level, and between 2 salt lakes, produced by the excavations made for building. From the centre of these lakes rise islets, consisting of masses of muriate and carbonate of soda. The salt produced by these wadis, or depressions of the soil, form an important article of commerce with Bornu and the whole of the Soudan. It would be impossible to imagine a more wretched place than Kirby. Its houses are empty, containing not so much as a mat. How could it be otherwise with a place liable to incessant raids from the Tuareg? The caravan now crossed the Tibu country, inhabited by a peaceful, hospitable people to whom, as keepers of the wells and reservoirs of the desert, the leaders of caravans pay passage money. The Tibus are a strong, active race, and when mounted on their nimble steeds, they display marvelous skill in throwing the lance, which the most vigorous of their warriors can hurl to a distance of 145 yards. Bilma is their chief city, and the residence of their sultan. On the arrival of the travellers at Bilma, the sultan, escorted by a number of men and women, came out to meet the strangers. The women were much better looking than those in the smaller towns. Some of them had indeed very pleasant faces, their white, regular teeth contrasting admirably with their shining black skins, and the 3 triangular flaps of hair streaming with oil. Coral ornaments in their noses and large amber necklaces round their throats gave them what Denham calls a seductive appearance. Some of them carried fans made of grass or hair, with which to keep off the flies. Others were provided with branches of trees. All, in fact, carried something in their hands which they waved above their heads. Their costume consisted of a loose piece of sowden cloth, fastened on the left shoulder and leaving the right uncovered, with a smaller piece wound about the head and falling on the shoulders or flung back. In spite of this paucity of clothing, there was not the least immodesty in their bearing. A mile from Bilma, and beyond a limpid spring, which appears to have been placed there by nature to afford a supply of water to travellers, lies a desert, which it takes no less than 10 days to cross. This was probably once a huge salt lake. On the 4th February 1823, the caravan reached Lari, a town on the northern boundary of Bornu in lat. 14°40 the inhabitants, astonished at the size of the kafilah, fled in terror at its approach. Beyond, however, says Denham, was an object full of interest to us, and the sight of it produced a sensation so gratifying and inspiring that it would be difficult for language to convey an idea of its force or pleasure. The great Lake Tichad, glowing with the golden rays of the sun in its strength, appeared to be within a mile of the spot on which we stood. On leaving Lari, the appearance of the country changed completely. The sandy desert was succeeded by a clay soil, clothed with grass and dotted with acacias and other trees of various species, amongst which grazed herds of antelopes, whilst guinea fowls and the turtle-doves of Barbary flew hither and thither above them. Towns took the place of villages, with huts of the shape of bells, thatched with dura straw. The travellers continued their journey southwards, rounding Lake Tichad, which they had first touched at its most northerly point. The districts bordering on this sheet of water were of a black, firm but muddy soil. The waters rise to a considerable height in winter and sink in proportion in the summer. The lake is of fresh water, rich in fish and frequented by hippopotami and aquatic birds. Near its centre on the southeast are the islands inhabited by the Bidamas, a race who live by pillaging the people of the mainland. The explorers had sent a messenger to Sheikh el-Khanami to ask permission to enter his capital, and an envoy speedily arrived to invite Bukhalum and his companions to Kuka. On their way thither, the travellers passed through Barwa, a fortified town which had thus far resisted the inroads of the Tuaregs, and crossed the Yiu, a large river, in some parts more than 500 feet in width, which, rising in the Soudan, flows into Lake Tichad. On the southern shores of this river rises a little town of the same name, about half the size of Barwa. The caravan soon reached the gates of Kuka, where, after a journey extending over 2 months and a half, they were received by a body of cavalry 4,000 strong, under perfect discipline. Amongst these troops was a corps of blacks forming the bodyguard of the sheikh, whose equipments resembled those of ancient chivalry. Member of the bodyguard of the Sheikh of Bornu. Member of the bodyguard of the Sheikh of Bornu. Facsimile of early engraving. They wore, Denham tells us, suits of chain armour covering the neck and shoulders. These were fastened above the head and fell in 2 portions, one in front and one behind, so as to protect the flanks of the horse and the thighs of the rider. A sort of casque or iron coif, kept in its place by red, white or yellow turbans, tied under the chin, completed the costume. The horses' heads were also guarded by iron plates. Their saddles were small and light, and their steel stirrups held only the point of the feet, which were clad in leather shoes, ornamented with crocodile skin. The horsemen managed their steeds admirably, as advancing at full gallop, brandishing their spears, they wheeled right and left of their guests, shouting Barca, Barca, blessing, blessing. Surrounded by this brilliant and fantastic escort, the English and Arabs entered the town, where a similar military display had been prepared in their honour. They were presently admitted to the presence of Sheikh el-Khanami, who appeared to be about 45 years old, and whose face was prepossessing, with a happy, intelligent, and benevolent expression. The English presented the letters of the Pacha, and when the Sheikh had read them, he asked Denham what had brought him and his companions to Bornu. "We came merely to see the country," replied Denham, "to study the character of its people, its scenery, and its productions." "You are welcome," was the reply. "It will be a pleasure to me to show you everything. I have ordered huts to be built for you in the town. You may go and see them accompanied by one of my people, and when you are recovered from the fatigue of your long journey, I shall be happy to see you." Reception of the mission. Reception of the mission. Facsimile of early engraving. The travellers soon afterwards obtained permission to make collections of such animals and plants as appeared to them curious, and to make notes of all their observations. They were thus enabled to collect a good deal of information about the towns near Kuka. Kuka, then the capital of Bornu, boasted of a market for the sale of slaves, sheep, oxen, cheese, rice, earthnuts, beans, indigo, and other productions of the country. Their 100,000 people might sometimes be seen haggling about the price of fish, poultry, meat, the last sold both raw and cooked, or that of brass, copper, amber, and coral. Linen was so cheap in these parts that some of the men wore shirts and trousers made of it. Beggars have a peculiar mode of exciting compassion. They station themselves at the entrance to the market, and holding up the rags of an old pair of trousers, they whine out to the passers-by, "See, I have no pantaloons." The novelty of this mode of proceeding, and the request for a garment, which seemed to them even more necessary than food, made our travellers laugh heartily until they became accustomed to it. Hitherto the English had had nothing to do with anyone but the Sheikh, who, content with wielding all real power, left the nominal sovereignty to the Sultan, an eccentric monarch, who never showed himself except through the bars of a wicker cage near the gate of his garden, as if he were some rare wild beast. Curious indeed were some of the customs of this court, not the least so the fancy for obesity. No one was considered elegant unless he had attained to a bulk, generally looked upon as very inconvenient. Some exquisites had stomachs so distended and prominent that they seemed literally to hang over the pommel of the saddle. And in addition to this, fashion prescribed a turban of such length and weight that its wearer had to carry his head on one side. These uncouth peculiarities rivaled those of the Turks of a masked ball, and the travellers had often hard work to preserve their gravity. To compensate, however, for the grotesque solemnity of the various receptions, a new field for observation was open, and much valuable information might now be acquired. Denham wished to proceed to the south at once, but the Sheikh was unwilling to risk the lives of the travellers entrusted to him by the Bey of Tripoli. On their entry into Bornu, the responsibility of Bukhalum for their safety was transferred to him. So earnest, however, were the entreaties of Denham, that el-Khanami at last sanctioned his accompanying Bukhalum in a jihrazi, or plundering expedition against the Kafirs or infidels. The Sheikh's army and the Arab troops passed in succession Yedi, a large walled city 20 miles from Angamu Badagri, and several other towns built on an alluvial soil which has a dark clay-like appearance. They entered Mandara, at the frontier town of Delo, beyond which the Sultan of the province with 500 horsemen met his guests. Denham describes Mahmud Beker as a man of short stature, about 50 years old, wearing a beard, painted of a most delicate azure blue. The presentations over, the Sultan at once turned to Denham and asked who he was, whence he came, what he wanted, and lastly if he were a Mohammedan. On Bukhalum's hesitating to reply, the Sultan turned away his head with the words, "So the Pacha numbers infidels amongst his friends." This incident had a very bad effect, and Denham was not again admitted to the presence of the Sultan. Lancer of the army of the Sultan of Begharmi. Lancer of the army of the Sultan of Begharmi. Facsimile of early engraving. The enemies of the Pacha of Bornu and the Sultan of Mandara were called Felatas. Their vast settlements extended far beyond Timbuktu. They are a handsome set of men, with skins of a dark bronze colour, which shows them to be of a race quite distinct from the Negroes. They are professors of Mohammedanism, and mix but little with the blacks. We shall presently have to speak more particularly of the Felatas, Fulas or Fans, as they are called throughout the Soudan. South of the town of Mora rises a chain of mountains, of which the loftiest peaks are not more than 2,500 feet high, but which, according to the natives, extend for more than 2 months' journey. The most salient point noticed by Denham in his description of the country is a vast and apparently interminable chain of mountains, shutting in the view on every side. This, though in his opinion, inferior to the Alps, Apennines, Jura and Sierra Morena in rugged magnificence and gigantic grandeur, are yet equal to them in picturesque effect. The lofty peaks of Valmy, Sava, Jogade, Munday and Sea, with clustering villages on their stony sides, rise on the east and west, while Horza, exceeding any of them in height and beauty, rises on the south with its ravines and precipices. Durkala, one of the chief Felata towns, was reduced to ashes by the invaders, who lost no time in pressing on to Musfaya, a position which, naturally very strong, was further defended by palisades manned by a numerous body of archers. The English traveller had to take part in the assault. The first onslaught of the Arabs appeared to carry all before it. The noise of the firearms, with the reputation for bravery and cruelty enjoyed by Bukhalum and his men, threw the Felatas into momentary confusion, and if the men of Mandara and Bornu had followed up their advantage and stormed the hill, the town would probably have fallen. The besieged, however, noticing the hesitation of their assailants, in their turn assumed the defensive, and rallying their archers discharged a shower of poisoned arrows, to which many an Arab fell a victim, and before which the forces of Bornu and Mandara gave way. Barca, the Bornu general, had 3 horses killed under him. Bukhalum and his steed were both wounded, and Denham was in a similar plight, with the skin of his face grazed by 1 arrow and 2 others lodged in his burnous. The retreat soon became a rout. Denham's horse fell under him, and the major had hardly regained his feet when he was surrounded by Felatas. 2 fled on the presentation of the Englishman's pistols, a third received the charge in his shoulder. Denham thought he was safe, when his horse fell a second time, flinging his master violently against a tree. This time when the major rose he found himself with neither horse nor weapons, and the next moment he was surrounded by enemies, who stripped him and wounded him in both hands and the right side, leaving him half dead at last to fight over his clothes, which seemed to them of great value. Availing himself of this lucky quarrel, Denham slipped under a horse standing by, and disappeared in the thicket. Naked, bleeding, wild with pain, he reached the edge of a ravine with a mountain stream flowing through it. His strength was all but gone, and he was clutching at a bough of a tree overhanging the water with a view to dropping himself into it, as the banks were very steep, and the branches were actually bending beneath his weight, when from beneath his hand, a gigantic liffer, the most venomous kind of serpent in the country, rose from its coil in the very act of striking. Horror struck, Denham let slip the branch and tumbled headlong into the water, but fortunately the shark revived him. He struck out almost unconsciously, swam to the opposite bank, and climbing it found himself safe from his pursuers. Fortunately the fugitive soon saw a group of horsemen amongst the trees, and in spite of the noise of the pursuit, he managed to shout loud enough to make them hear him. They turned out to be Barca Ghana and Bukhalum with some Arabs. Mounted on a sorry steed, with no other clothing than an old blanket swarming with vermin, Denham travelled 37 miles. The pain of his wounds was greatly aggravated by the heat, the thermometer being at 32 degrees. The only results of the expedition, which was to have brought in such quantities of booty and numerous slaves, were the deaths of Bukhalum and 36 of his Arabs, the wounding of nearly all the rest, and the loss or destruction of all the horses. The 80 miles between Mora and Kuka were traversed in 6 days. Denham was kindly received in the latter town by the Sultan, who sent him a native garment to replace his lost wardrobe. The major had hardly recovered from his wounds and fatigue before he took part in a new expedition, sent to Munga, a province on the west of Bornu, by the Sheikh, whose authority had never been fully recognized there, and whose claim for tribute had been refused by the inhabitants. Map of Denham and Clapperton's journey. Grave Par e Moriu. Denham and Oudney left Kuka on the 22nd May, and crossed the U, then nearly dried up but an important stream in the rainy season, and visited Burney, with the ruins of the capital of the same name, which was capable of containing 200,000 inhabitants. The travellers also passed through the ruins of Gambaroo with its magnificent buildings, the favourite residence of the former Sultan, destroyed by the Felatas, Kabshari, Basaka, Baitli, and many other towns or villages, whose numerous populations submitted without a struggle to the Sultan of Bornu. The rainy season was disastrous to the members of the expedition. Clapperton fell dangerously ill of fever, and Oudney, whose chest was delicate even before he left England, grew weaker every day. Denham alone kept up. On the 14th of December, when the rainy season was drawing to a close, Clapperton and Oudney started for Carno. We shall presently relate the particulars of this interesting part of their expedition. 7 days later, an ensign named Toole arrived at Kuka after a journey from Tripoli, which had occupied only 3 months and 14 days. In February 1824, Denham and Toole made a trip into Lugan, on the south of Lake Teachad. All the districts near the lake and its tributary, the Shari, are marshy and flooded during the rainy season. The unhealthiness of the climate was fatal to young Toole, who died at Angala on the 26th of February at the early age of 22. Persevering, enterprising, bright and obliging, with plenty of pluck and prudence, Toole was a model explorer. Lugan was then very little known. Its capital, Kernock, contained no less than 15,000 inhabitants. The people of Lugan, especially the women, who are very industrious and manufacture the finest linens and fabrics of the closest texture, are handsomer and more intelligent than those of Bornu. The necessary interview with the Sultan ended, after an exchange of complimentary speeches and handsome presents, in this strange proposal from His Majesty to the travellers: "If you have come to buy female slaves, you need not be at the trouble to go further, as I will sell them to you as cheap as possible." Denham had great trouble in convincing the merchant prince that such traffic was not the aim of his journey, but that the love of science alone had brought him to Lugan. On the 2nd of March, Denham returned to Kuka, and on the 20th of May he was witness to the arrival of Lieutenant Tyrwhitt, who had come to take up his residence as consul at the court of Bornu, bearing costly presents for the Sultan. Portrait of Clapperton. Portrait of Clapperton. Facsimile of early engraving. After a final excursion in the direction of Manu, the capital of Canaan, and a visit to the Dargana, who formerly occupied all the districts about Lake Fitri, the Major joined Clapperton in his return journey to Tripoli, starting on the 16th of April, and arriving there in safety at the close of a long and arduous journey, whose geographical results, important in any case, had been greatly enhanced by the labours of Clapperton. To the adventures and discoveries of the latter we must now turn. Clapperton and Oudney started for Carno, a large fellata town on the west of Lake Teachad, on the 14th of December 1823, followed the Yew as far as Damasak, and visited the ruins of Burney, and those of Barra on the shores of a lake formed by the overflowing of the Yew, Dargamu and Bikidarfi, all towns of Hausa. The people of this province, who were very numerous before the invasion of the fellatas, are armed with bows and arrows, and trade in tobacco, nuts, guro, antimony, tanned hares' skins, and cotton stuffs in the piece and made into clothes. The caravans soon left the banks of the Yew or Gambaru, and entered a wooded country, which was evidently under water in the rainy season. The travellers then entered the province of Katagum, where the governor received them with great cordiality, assuring them that their arrival was quite an event to him, as it would be to the Sultan of the fellatas, who, like himself, had never before seen an Englishman. He also assured them that they would find all they required in his district, just as at Kuka. The only thing which seemed to surprise him much was the fact that his visitors wanted neither slaves, horses, nor silver, and that the sole proof of his friendship they required was permission to collect flowers and plants, and to travel in his country. According to Clapperton's observations, Katagum is situated in lat. 12 degrees 1711 N and about 12 degrees E long. Before the fellatas were conquered, it was on the borders of the province of Bornu. It can send into the Phi cavalry and foot soldiers armed with bows and arrows, swords and lances. Wheat and oxen with slaves are its chief articles of commerce. The citadel is the strongest the English had seen, except that of Tripoli. Entered by gates which are shut at night, it is defended by 2 parallel walls and 3 dry moats, one inside, one out, and the third between the 2 walls, which are 20 feet high and 10 feet wide at the base. A ruined mosque is the only other object of interest in the town, which consists of mud houses and contains some 700 or 800 inhabitants. There the English for the first time saw cowries used as money. Hitherto native cloth had been the sole medium of exchange. South of Katagum is the Yakoba country, called Mauchi by the Mohammedans. According to accounts received by Clapperton, the people of Yakoba, which is shut in by limestone mountains, are cannibals. The Mohammedans, however, who have an intense horror of the Kafirs, give no other proof of this accusation than the statement that they have seen human heads and limbs hanging against the walls of the houses. In Yakoba rises the Yew, a river which dries up completely in the summer, but, according to the people who live on its banks, rises and falls regularly every week throughout the rainy season. On the 11th of January, the journey was resumed, but a halt had to be made at Murmur at noon of the same day, as Audney showed signs of such extreme weakness and exhaustion that Clapperton feared he could not last through another day. He had been gradually failing ever since they left the mountains of Obury in Fezzen, where he had inflammation of the throat from sitting in a draught when overheated. On the 12th of January, Audney took a cup of coffee at daybreak, and at his request Clapperton changed camels with him. He then helped him to dress, and leaning on his servant, the doctor left the tent. He was about to attempt to mount his camel when Clapperton saw death in his face. He supported him back to the tent, where to his intense grief he expired at once without a groan or any sign of suffering. Clapperton lost no time in asking the governor's permission to bury his comrade, and this being obtained, he dug a grave for him himself under an old mimosa tree near one of the gates of the town. After the body had been washed according to the custom of the country, it was wrapped in some of the turban shawls which were to have served as presents on the further journey. The servants carried it to its last resting place, and Clapperton read the English burial service at the grave. When the ceremony was over, he surrounded the modest resting place with a wall of earth to keep off beasts of prey, and had 2 sheep killed, which he divided amongst the poor. Thus closed the career of the young naturalist and ship's doctor, Audney. His terrible malady, whose germs he had brought with him from England, had prevented him from rendering so much service to the expedition as the government had expected from him, although he never spared himself, declaring that he felt better on the march than when resting. Knowing that his weakened constitution would not admit of any sustained exertion on his part, he would never damp the ardour of his companions. After this sad event, Clapperton resumed his journey to Carno, halting successively at Digu, situated in a well-cultivated district, rich in flocks, Katangora beyond the province of Katagum, Zanjia once, judging from its extent and the ruined walls still standing, an important place near the end of the Douche chain of hills, Gurkwa with a finer marketplace than that of Tripoli, and Souchwa surrounded by an imposing earthwork. Kano, the Chana of Edrisi and other Arab geographers, and the great emporium of the Kingdom of Hausa, was reached on the 20th January. Clapperton tells us that he had hardly entered the gates before his expectations were disappointed. After the brilliant description of the Arabs, he had expected to see a town of vast extent. The houses were 1/4 of a mile from the walls, and stood here and there in little groups, separated by large pools of stagnant water. I might have dispensed with the care I had bestowed on my dress. He had donned his naval uniform, for the inhabitants, absorbed in their own affairs, let me pass without remark, and never so much as looked at me. Kano, the capital of the province of that name and one of the chief towns of the Soudan, is situated in En Lat, 12 degrees 0, 19 and E long, 9 degrees 20. It contains between 30 and 40,000 inhabitants, of whom the greater number are slaves. The market, bounded on the east and west by vast reedy swamps, is the haunt of numerous flocks of ducks, storks and vultures, which act as scavengers to the town. In this market, stocked with all the provisions in use in Africa, beef, mutton, goats and sometimes even camel's flesh are sold. Writing paper of French manufacture, scissors and knives, antimony, tin, red silk, copper bracelets, glass beads, coral, amber, steel rings, silver ornaments, turban shawls, cotton cloths, calico, Moorish habiliments and many other articles are exposed for sale in large quantities in the marketplace of Kano. There Clapperton bought for 3 piasters an English cotton umbrella from Gadames. He also visited the slave market, where the unfortunate human chattels are as carefully examined as volunteers for the Navy are by our own inspectors. The town is very unhealthy, the swamps cutting it in 2, and the holes produced by the removal of the earth for building, produce permanent malaria. It is the fashion at Kano to stain the teeth and limbs with the juice of a plant called gurgi, and with tobacco which produces a bright red color. Guro nuts are chewed, and sometimes even swallowed when mixed with trona, a habit not peculiar to Hausa, for it extends to Bornu where it is strictly forbidden to women. The people of Hausa smoke a native tobacco. On the 23rd of February, Clapperton started for Sakatu. He crossed a picturesque, well-cultivated country, whose wooded hills gave it the appearance of an English park. Herds of beautiful white or dun-coloured oxen gave animation to the scenery. The most important places passed en route by Clapperton were Gardania, a densely populated town, the inhabitants of which had been sold as slaves by the Feletas, Dunkami, Zermia, the capital of Gambra, Kagera, Kwari and the wells of Kamon, where he met an escort sent by the Sultan. Sakatu was the most thickly populated city that the explorer had seen in Africa. Its well-built houses form regular streets, instead of clustering in groups as in the other towns of Hausa. It is surrounded by a wall between 20 and 30 feet high, pierced by 12 gates, which are closed every evening at sunset, and it boasts of 2 mosques, with a market and a large square opposite to the Sultan's residence. The inhabitants, most of whom are fellaters, own many slaves, and the latter, those at least who are not in domestic service, work at some trade for their master's profit. They are weavers, masons, blacksmiths, shoemakers, or husbandmen.